Why was everyone laughing? Not loud, just that nervous, guilty kind of laughter that happens when people want to belong. The wind howled like a living thing across the cliff, slapping the faces of the Marines and sailors standing there in full gear. Somewhere in that noise, a voice cut through, sharp, mocking, confident. "You sure you've even held a rope before, sweetheart?" The man who said it, Sergeant Thorne, was the kind who believed rank gave him the right to measure worth. He said the word sweetheart like a verdict. The others chuckled on cue. It wasn't cruelty, it was fear dressed as humor. Petty Officer Anna Morgan didn't answer. She just stared at the ape rope in her hands. Fingers steady, breath even. In that moment the world for her narrowed to touch, pressure, and breath control. Nothing else mattered. The insult didn't exist, only the mission did. Across the range, Command Master Chief Miller watched in silence. He wasn't laughing. He'd seen something, the way her stance never wavered, how the harness sat perfectly centered on her hips, not a strap twisted. Her gear wasn't just worn, it was lived in. Small custom tape grips, a keeper loop adjusted by hand. Signs of someone who'd used this gear 1,000 times, not someone new. Miller felt the first tug of memory. Afghanistan, dust storms, the stillness of operators who didn't need to yell to prove they were ready. He recognized that kind of calm. Thorne didn't. He saw hesitation where there was preparation. He saw silence and mistook it for weakness. He swaggered closer, boots grinding gravel. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you realizing that's a 200-foot drop and you're in way over your head?" She didn't move, didn't even blink. The wind pressed against her uniform and still, no reaction. Inside she counted her breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 hold, 4 out. Box breathing. The rhythm of people who have seen chaos and refuse to let it own them. The others shifted uncomfortably. Even they could feel something strange in the air now, an imbalance. The sergeant was performing, the sailor was. He smiled like a man mistaking the tremor before an earthquake for surrender. "There's no shame in backing out. We can get one of the big boys to go first, show you how it's done." His tone dripped with pity disguised as professionalism. She just looked at him once, expression unreadable, then turned back to her rope. "Ready," she said simply. One word. Flat, measured, impossibly calm. It hit him harder than an insult. Because how do you fight someone who won't even play your game? The laughter died. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if the air itself was waiting for what came next. Thorne took a step back and gestured at the edge. "Your turn, princess. Show us what you've got, or don't." Morgan walked forward. Each step deliberate, crunch, pause, adjust. Boots settling into loose gravel, like she knew exactly how the ground would shift. The metallic click of her carabiner locking onto the anchor point cracked through the tension. It sounded like punctuation at the end of a long, silent sentence. She didn't just clip in, she checked, double-checked, then felt the gate with her thumb. Not procedure, ritual. Behind her, Thorne folded his arms, smirking. He didn't understand that ritual saves lives. He'd forgotten that silence isn't hesitation, it's discipline. She leaned back into the rope slowly, transferring weight like she was negotiating with gravity itself. Miller narrowed his eyes. He recognized every detail now, the micro-adjustments, the breathing rhythm, the weight distribution. That wasn't standard Navy training. That was something else, something rarer. And Thorne, blind to it all, opened his mouth again. For crying out loud, just go. Then he did it. The shove. It wasn't subtle. It was a hard, impatient push between the shoulder blades, a move meant to humiliate, a show of dominance, a violation of every safety rule in the book. Gasps erupted behind him. A couple of sailors even shouted. For half a heartbeat, everyone expected to see panic, flailing arms, a scream swallowed by the canyon wind. But Morgan didn't fall. She moved. The shove became momentum. She folded it into her motion like it belonged to her. Instead of resisting, she flowed with it, turned it into a dive so clean, so deliberate, it looked choreographed. 1 second she was on the ledge, the next she was gone, rope singing through the anchor point, cutting a single, perfect note through the roar of wind. The cliff swallowed her whole. Then silence. Thorne's smirk shattered. His face drained white as realization sank in. He just shoved a sailor off a 200-foot drop. The rope hummed, tension cutting through the air, then stopped. She let go. One of the trainees screamed. Chaos exploded. People ran to the edge. Orders shouted. The sound of boots and panic. But Miller didn't move. He knew that look before she'd gone over. He'd seen it in men and women who didn't fear gravity because they'd already made peace with it. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the rock face. And then movement. Not falling. Climbing. Far below, a shape began to rise, small at first, then clearer, a figure scaling the sheer granite wall like the laws of physics didn't apply. Her hands and boots found invisible holds. No chalk, no hesitation, just fluid, relentless motion. She wasn't rappelling anymore, she was ascending. No rope for support, only guidance. No panic, only rhythm. Every move precise, efficient, graceful in a way that felt alien. The crowd froze. Even the wind seemed to mute itself. She moved like she'd done it 1,000 times in places where silence was survival. A pattern that looked almost animal, counter-pressure, dynamic tension, the body becoming its own machine. It was beautiful, terrifying, and completely impossible. By the time Thorne's mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing, she was halfway up. Every insult he'd thrown at her turned into irony. The wind that was supposed to push her off became her ally. Her small frame, once mocked, let her slip into cracks no larger man could use. The higher she rose, the quieter the world became. All replaced laughter. She reached the lip, one gloved hand gripping the edge with unshakable strength. No grunt of effort, no yell of triumph. Just a breath, controlled, steady. She pulled herself over the ledge and stood. Straight, balanced, calm. Then she unclipped, coiled the rope neatly, and looked at him. "Exercise complete, Sergeant." 2 words, and the ground might as well have opened beneath Thorne's feet. The silence after was thunderous. No one dared breathe. Then a voice cut through, calm, deep, commanding. "Sergeant Thorne, my office, now." Master Chief Miller was already walking forward, jaw locked, eyes like polished steel. He didn't even look at the sergeant as he passed. Instead, he turned to the communications tech at the command station. "Pull up Petty Officer Morgan's personnel file." The young specialist fumbled with the tablet, fingers trembling. He turned the screen. Miller stared at it for a long, unreadable moment. Then he took the tablet and walked it back toward Thorne. Held it inches from his face. The color drained completely from the sergeant's skin as he read. Name Morgan Anna. Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. DVGRU. SEAL Team 6. The words detonated in silence. Miller didn't stop there. He scrolled down slowly. Primary skill, Naval Special Warfare Operator. Qualifications, Master Breacher, Advanced Sniper, Halo Jumper, Combat Medic. Awards, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star V ×2, Purple Heart ×3. The list kept going. Thorne's eyes flicked over each line, his mind rejecting what it saw. She wasn't a student. She wasn't here to learn. She was here to evaluate them. Miller lowered the tablet, voice quiet but lethal. "That was not a rappel, Sergeant. That was a Tier 1 vertical insertion technique. It's used in denied territory when every standard system fails and the mission still has to go on." He let the words hang there, heavy, final. "You don't learn that in any school. You learn it in places that don't exist on maps. Thorne couldn't speak. His hands twitched, mouth dry. He looked at Morgan like she was something from another world because she was. Miller straightened, and then, breaking every norm of rank, brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute. "Petty Officer Morgan," he said, voice edged with reverence. "On behalf of this command, I apologize for the unprofessional conduct you were subjected to." No one spoke, no one even moved. A command master chief, saluting a petty officer. It wasn't procedure, it was respect. Morgan returned the gesture with a crisp nod. "Understood, Master Chief." No emotion, no smugness, no victory. Just professionalism. Because for her, the incident was already over. The problem had been identified and corrected. Mission complete. By the time the trainees removed their harnesses, whispers had already begun. By dinner, the whispers had become legend. They called it Morgan's Ascent. And though the details would twist and grow with every retelling, the heart of it would remain the same. A quiet woman had been pushed off a cliff, and she climbed back up, proving that gravity bends for those who have mastered themselves. How do you face a room after you've been humiliated in front of it? Sergeant Thorne didn't. He couldn't. When the sun set that night, his bunk felt colder than usual. The laughter in the barracks wasn't laughter anymore, it was whispers. Quiet, sharp things that sliced through walls and pride. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the echo of her voice replaying in his mind. "Exercise complete, Sergeant." 2 words, that's all it took to dismantle him. He'd spent years crafting an image of authority built on volume and intimidation. And in less than a minute, a woman half his size had taken it apart without raising her tone. But this isn't her story yet. It's his reckoning. By morning, he'd already been summoned. The report had been filed, witness statements gathered, Master Chief Miller's review concise, clinical, damning. Unsafe conduct resulting in life-threatening risk. Violation of safety protocol. Behavior unbecoming of an instructor. He stood at attention in Miller's office, the air thick with silence. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs, a reminder of the gravity he'd forgotten to respect. Miller didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you know what you did, Sergeant?" Thorne opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He tried again. "Sir, I—" "Don't," Miller interrupted, calm but final. "Don't insult either of us with excuses. You shoved a SEAL evaluator off a 200-foot cliff." The words hit like a hammer. Thorne's throat tightened. "I didn't know who she was," he managed, voice small. "That's the point," Miller said. "You shouldn't need to know someone's record to respect them." Silence. It stretched for what felt like hours. Then Miller leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "You looked at her and saw weakness. You saw gender. You saw your own reflection of insecurity. That's what pushed her, not your hands, Sergeant, your assumptions." Thorne's eyes burned, but not from anger. Shame has a way of hollowing a man out, leaving nothing but the echo of who he thought he was. Miller signed the paperwork in front of him, each stroke deliberate. "You're relieved of duty as range safety officer effective immediately. You'll remain assigned to base until review." There it was, the quiet death of a career. No explosion, no courtroom drama, just ink on paper. When Thorne walked out, the corridors seemed longer, emptier. The laughter he used to command now died when he passed. No one saluted. No one met his eyes. He'd become a ghost before he'd even left. And somewhere beyond the wire, Petty Officer Anna Morgan continued her work, silent, methodical, unaffected. She didn't talk about what happened, didn't seek credit. She filed her evaluations, attended briefings, ran her fitness tests. To her it had been a moment, a test of composure, nothing more. But to everyone else, it was already myth. In the chow hall that night, someone whispered it at the next table. Hey, did you hear about the seal they tried to push off a cliff? The story spread like wildfire through dry grass. Each retelling added detail the teller didn't witness. In one version, the wind was hurricane force. In another, she climbed with one hand bleeding, boots slipping against rain-slick rock. By midnight, she wasn't just a sailor anymore. She was a legend. The story had grown teeth. And legends don't ask permission to live. Days passed. The training base settled back into its rhythm, but something had changed. Something subtle. The female trainees, those who'd spent months being talked over, second-guessed, patronized, stood a little taller. Their laughter carried less apology. They looked each instructor square in the eye. No one said it out loud, but they all knew why. Morgan's ascent wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. She climbed for all of them. And yet, if you'd asked her about it, she would have brushed it off with a shrug. When she wasn't in training sessions, she was in the gym, alone, working grip strength, endurance, breathing control. Her body moved like a metronome, controlled, repetitive, efficient. One evening, Miller found her there. The clang of weights echoed in the dim light. "You're not supposed to be invisible, you know," he said. Morgan paused mid-set, lowered the bar, sat up. "I'm not invisible, Master Chief. I'm just not loud." He smiled faintly. That's the understatement of the year. He sat on the bench across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "Do you know what they're calling it?" She shook her head. "Morgan's ascent." Her brow furrowed slightly. "That's excessive." "Maybe," Miller said, "but you gave them something to believe in. You reminded them what professionalism looks like." She didn't respond, just reached for her water bottle, eyes thoughtful. Miller studied her in silence. "You ever get tired of being the quiet one in the room?" Morgan met his gaze. "No, Master Chief, the quiet one usually survives." It wasn't arrogance. It was experience speaking, a truth carved from years in places the rest of the world never knew existed. Miller nodded slowly. "You were DVGRU, weren't you?" Her jaw tightened. "Was." He caught the past tense. "Why'd you leave?" She hesitated. The question hung there like a live wire. Then she said softly, "Sometimes even the best teams need a ghost." He didn't press, he understood. Every operator carried ghosts. Some wore them like armor. Others, like her, wore them like silence. That night a storm rolled in. The kind that shakes windows and makes the ocean sound like it's tearing itself apart. Morgan sat alone in her quarters, staring at the rain carving streaks down the glass. On her desk lay a single photo, faded, creased, a man in desert gear, his arm around her shoulder, both smiling. She turned the photo face down. Her phone buzzed once. A message, no sender ID, just coordinates. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries weight, the kind that knows exactly what it means. But she didn't respond, not yet. She had one more week on base, one more evaluation to finish, and a promise to keep to herself. 2 days later, Thorne found her in the hangar, packing gear into a duffel. He looked different, smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed. "Petty officer." She turned, "Sergeant." He swallowed, his voice wavered. "I came to apologize." Morgan said nothing. "I made assumptions. I thought I knew what strength looked like. I was wrong." He took a breath that seemed to hurt. "You didn't deserve that, none of it." She studied him for a long moment. The man standing before her wasn't the loud instructor from the cliff. He was just a human being stripped bare of pretense. Finally, she said quietly, "Assumptions are heavy, Sergeant." He blinked. "What?" "Travel light." The words landed like truth often does, soft but irreversible. She slung her duffel over her shoulder and walked away, boots echoing down the metal floor until they disappeared into distance. Thorne stayed there, staring at the empty space she'd left behind, the words looping in his mind. Travel light. It was the first real lesson he'd learned in years, and it had nothing to do with tactics. Later that evening, someone pinned a photograph to the main bulletin board outside the training division's office. Grainy, blurred. A single frame captured from a long-lens camera. Morgan mid-ascent, halfway up the cliff, a small figure against endless stone. Beneath it, someone had written 2 words in black marker. Travel light. By morning, everyone on base had seen it. No one knew who posted it, no one took it down. And somewhere, high on the cliff's edge, the faint marks of her boots remained, permanent etchings into the granite. Proof that sometimes the ground you fall from is the same ground you rise to redefine. Days bled into weeks, the legend only grew. They talked about her in the gym, in mess halls, during smoke breaks. Instructors who hadn't even been there swore they saw it firsthand. Miller didn't correct them. He just listened. Because he knew what legends did, they filled the spaces facts couldn't reach. They built belief where policy couldn't. Morgan had become more than a name. She'd become a compass. And yet she carried herself as if none of it existed, always early, always silent, always precise. It unnerved people, her lack of ego, her refusal to capitalize on fame. But that was her power. The less she spoke, the louder her actions echoed. In her absence, the base changed, slowly then all at once. Condescension faded from the training grounds. The laughter turned respectful. People started checking their gear twice, controlling their breathing before descents. Because somewhere deep down, they imagined she was still watching. And maybe she was. At the end of her final week, Miller caught her as she was loading into a transport truck. "You heading out?" She nodded. "Orders came through this morning." He extended his hand. She shook it firmly. "You left this place better than you found it," he said. Morgan gave the faintest smile. "That's the job, Master Chief." As she climbed into the truck, Miller called after her, "Wherever you're going next, stay quiet." She looked back once, the wind tugging at her hair. Always. The truck rumbled away, dust trailing in the cold morning air. And just like that, she was gone. But the echo of her silence remained. That night, as the sun dropped into the ocean and the cliffs turned gold, Miller walked to the training ledge. He looked up at the faint scuff marks, now barely visible in the fading light. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "True strength never shouts." Then he turned and walked away, the sea wind carrying his words into the dark. Because some lessons don't need to be written down. They're carved into the rock and remembered in silence. When a story leaves the base, it stops belonging to the people who lived it. Weeks had passed since she'd driven away. The dust from her transport had long settled, but the legend had only grown. It slipped through inboxes, whispered across command chains, rode the backs of rumors and training memos. Everywhere the story landed, it changed shape. Some said she'd scaled the cliff in a hurricane. Others swore she'd done it one-handed with a broken wrist. One version claimed she'd vanished mid-ascent, reappeared on the ridge like a ghost. But the truth, it was simpler and far more dangerous. She hadn't done it to impress anyone. She'd done it because she had to, because control wasn't a choice, it was survival. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew that lesson wasn't finished teaching itself. The following month, the story reached a classroom 1,000 miles away, Coronado. Basic underwater demolition training. Bud S., the crucible where legends either began or ended. An instructor played the grainy video clip on an overhead projector. No name, no sound, just a silhouette rising against stone. When the lights came back on, he said quietly, "That is what composure under pressure looks like." The room was silent. 50 candidates stared at the frozen image. One whispered, "Who was she?" The instructor only said, someone who never needed to tell you. That was the power of anonymity. It wasn't mystery, it was discipline. Back at the cliff, life went on. A new rotation of recruits arrived. Fresh faces, fresh arrogance. But something lingered in the air. The instructors didn't yell as much. They corrected, guided, taught. The laughter that once bit now softened into respect. The cliff had a new name now. Morgan's Ledge. The designation wasn't official, but everyone used it. Even the training schedule listed it that way. And when recruits asked why, the instructors would tell them. Not the rumor, not the embellished myth. Just the core truth. A quiet professional had been pushed once. And she climbed back. One afternoon, Master Chief Miller stood at that ledge again. The wind howled just like before and the sea crashed far below. But this time, the laughter behind him wasn't mocking, it was nervous excitement. A group of young sailors, men and women both, waited their turn to rappel. They checked each other's gear twice. Some whispered little prayers. "All right," Miller said, his voice cutting through the wind, steady and even. "Before you go over that edge, remember something. That rope doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if you're loud, strong, scared, or silent. It only cares about how well you trust it and yourself." He turned to the cliff, pointing at a faint mark high up, barely visible in the sunlight. "See that?" Heads tilted upward. That's what happens when someone refuses to break. The recruits didn't laugh. They just nodded. Elsewhere, far beyond the ocean, Anna Morgan sat inside a dim, windowless hangar. The air smelled of oil and metal and something colder, anticipation. Across the room, a small team of operators prepped for a night exercise. Blacked-out helicopters, no insignia, no questions. Morgan sat quietly on a crate, hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone lukewarm. Her gear was laid out in perfect order beside her. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not officially. She'd been recalled, temporarily. The message had said evaluation assistance, but the faces in the hangar told her the truth. This was no evaluation. A younger operative, a woman barely 30, approached her. "Ma'am, you're Anna Morgan, right?" Morgan glanced up, offering a nod. "I heard about you," the woman said. "The cliff, they said you climbed without a rope." Morgan's tone was soft. "I used one, just differently." The woman smiled, awkward but genuine. "Still, you gave a lot of us something to aim for." Morgan looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Don't aim for me. Aim for the work." The woman blinked, unsure how to respond. Morgan continued, "The legend's just noise. The discipline, that's the truth. Focus there." Then she went back to coiling her rope. Later that night, when the exercise began, the wind outside the hangar felt almost the same as that day on the cliff, restless, cutting. Her team moved like shadows across the tarmac, silent, efficient, one purpose. Morgan took point. Each step across gravel echoed softly, reminding her how easily noise could betray you. The mission was routine extraction training, but in her mind, every operation carried ghosts. They boarded the helicopter, and as the rotors spun to life, she looked out across the darkness. Below her, somewhere in another part of the world, cliffs waited, oceans churned, and the echoes of that old wind followed her still. At the same hour, back on base, Gunnery Sergeant Keller, the new range safety officer, stood by the ledge with a flashlight. He was older than Thorne had been, calmer, wiser. He stared out into the night, the beam of his light catching the faint outline of those old boot marks halfway up the rock face. He'd seen a lot in 20 years, but nothing quite like that. He whispered to himself, "The most dangerous person on the field is the one you underestimate." It had become a saying now, a quiet mantra passed from instructor to recruit. Every time someone joked, every time someone assumed too much, someone else would just murmur it, "Don't underestimate the quiet one." And the laughter would stop. A month later, Miller received a package. No return label. Inside, a small rock fragment, granite rough-edged. Attached was a handwritten note. For the ledge, replace what I took. A.M. He smiled, setting the stone on his desk. Sometime, silence sends its own message. But legends are double-edged things. For every person inspired, there was someone threatened by it. Somewhere in the administrative chain, reports were being reviewed. Discussions were being had. Unverified performance, one memo read. Unauthorized climbing method. Potential deviation from safety protocol. Paper trails didn't care about inspiration. They cared about order. Miller fought quietly in those meetings. He argued that the story had done more to shape discipline and humility than any manual could. Some listened. Some didn't. But by then, the legend had grown beyond reach. You can't file away a story once it's taken root in people's pride. Meanwhile, Morgan continued her quiet work. Different missions, different continents. Same discipline. She didn't tell anyone where she'd been or what she'd done. But the scars on her hands deepened, and her eyes held the kind of calm only earned by surviving places that erased lesser people. Every once in a while, when she had a spare hour, she'd find a wall, rock, concrete didn't matter, and climb. Not for training. Not for glory. Just to remember. To remember that control is freedom. That breathing is everything. That silence can be the loudest answer in the world. Back at the base, the recruits kept coming, new faces every quarter. Each group heard the story. Each group stood at the ledge, feeling the same wind, staring at the same impossible height. And every instructor told it slightly differently. But at the heart of each telling, one line always stayed the same. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, she showed. That became doctrine. Unwritten but binding. And somewhere, under layers of noise and policy, the institution itself began to shift. Years later, a young female recruit, barely 19, stood at that same cliff. Her heart pounded as she looked down. Her instructor, a woman, now stood beside her. "You scared?" The recruit nodded, "A little." "Good," the instructor said. "Means you're paying attention." They checked the harness together. The recruit hesitated. "What if I can't do it?" The instructor smiled faintly, pointing toward the faint marks high above. "Someone once told me, the noise outside doesn't matter. You just focus on the next correct action." The recruit blinked. "Who said that?" "Doesn't matter," the instructor replied. She never cared about credit. The recruit took a deep breath, found her center, and stepped backward off the edge. For a moment, gravity tried to win. Then discipline answered. The rope held. And the cycle continued. That night in the barracks, someone new asked, "Hey, who was Morgan really?" No one answered. They just looked at each other and smiled. Because the truth wasn't in the name. It was in the standard she'd left behind. A quiet professional doesn't need an audience. Only a mission. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, Anna Morgan sat on a rooftop overlooking a foreign city. A rifle rested beside her. The moonlight traced silver lines across her hands. Below in the streets, chaos moved, small, distant, meaningless. She took a slow breath in, held it for 4, exhaled for 4. Her heart rate slowed. The world steadied. The noise outside didn't matter. It never had. She adjusted her scope, eyes calm, breath silent, mind unshaken. A quiet professional doing what she'd always done. Turning pressure into precision. And if anyone had been there to see her, they might have noticed the faintest smile. Because far away, across an ocean, her lesson still lived. Sometimes legacy isn't carved into stone. It breathes. It whispers. It moves through hands and hearts, through repetition and discipline. And somewhere between the wind and the silence, Anna Morgan's ascent never ended. She was still climbing. There are missions no one writes about. They don't make the news. They don't earn medals. They just happen in the dark. Anna Morgan had lived most of her life there. Years before the ledge, before the shove that turned into legend, there been another cliff half a world away. No audience, no laughter, no second chances. It was the Hindu Kush, thin air, thin hope. A four-man team, insertion at night. Objective, recover a hostage before dawn. She remembered the cold most of all. It cut through gear, through skin, through thought. They'd gone in light, 2 rifles, rope, 1 radio that worked when it felt like it. Halfway up the ridge, the comms failed. One of the men slipped, Jones, her breacher. The fall snapped his leg, compound fracture. No extraction window left. The team leader panicked. She didn't. She'd done what she always did, slowed her breathing, shut out the noise. 1 breath at a time, 1 movement at a time. She splinted the leg with tape and carbon rods from her pack, redistributed his weight across the rope system, and kept moving. No drama, no shouting. Just the rhythm of effort, the quiet music of survival. Hours later, they reached the compound, executed the breach, and walked the hostage out under a sky bleeding red at the edges. No one mentioned her name in the debrief. They just wrote mission accomplished, no fatalities. And that was enough. Those memories returned sometimes, uninvited. Not as nightmares. Just fragments. A hand reaching, a breath counting. The smell of dust and blood. Now, years later, she found herself back in the States, in an office lined with framed commendations she never asked for. The Pentagon wanted her input on a new training syllabus, resilience development for high-stress environments. They wanted her method. But how do you teach silence? How do you explain composure that isn't confidence, but something colder, something forged where emotion is a liability? A young colonel across the table smiled politely. We'd like to quantify what you did at Coronado, petty officer. Your response to stress was extraordinary. We believe it can be modeled. Morgan looked at him, quietly. He meant well, most of them did. Sir, she said, you can't model discipline, you can only choose it. He hesitated, pen still in his hand. With respect, everything can be modeled. Not that, she replied softly. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. She walked out into the corridor, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt a strange emptiness pressing at her chest. The Navy had turned her story into a data point. They wanted to bottle the quiet. But the quiet wasn't a technique, it was a truth. The truth that the world doesn't owe you fairness. That control is not a gift. It's a decision you make when everything else is stripped away. That's what she had learned on the cliffs, in deserts, in rooms no one will ever admit existed. And it was the one lesson she could never quite translate. That night, she sat alone in a small apartment overlooking the city. No medals on the wall. No reminders of the life she'd lived. Just a single notebook. Inside, handwritten notes, fragments of philosophy. Control your breathing, control your mind. Noise is inevitable, response is optional. Assumptions are heavy, travel light. She didn't write them for anyone else. They were reminders for herself. A manual for a mind that refused to stay still. She closed the notebook, stared out at the skyline, and whispered something only the city could hear. Don't let them turn it into noise. Back on the coast, Command Master Chief Miller was preparing to retire. 30 years in uniform, 30 years of dust, wind, and orders. But before he left, he wanted to leave something behind. He spent 3 nights drafting a final memo, one that would go to the commanding officer of the training command. It wasn't long. Just a single page titled The Quiet Standard. He wrote, "Respect is not earned through rank or volume. It's earned through precision, discipline, and composure under pressure. The lesson of Morgan's Ledge should remain part of our curriculum indefinitely. It is not a myth. It is doctrine." He signed it, dated it, sent it. Then, as he packed his office, he glanced at the small rock fragment she had mailed him months earlier. It sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light. He smiled faintly. "You did more than climb a cliff, Morgan," he murmured. "You rewired the place." Elsewhere in a dim operations room, a young intelligence officer scrolled through old reports. One caught her eye. "DVGRU, Red Squadron Operation Khorshid." A single debrief note in the margin read, "Operator displayed exceptional vertical mobility and composure under enemy fire." There was no name. But she knew. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the text, and whispered to herself, "They never wrote you down, did they?" Some stories were never meant to be archived. Months later, Morgan stood on a mountain ridge again, this time in training gear, not combat load. A new generation of operators was being tested, and she'd been asked to evaluate. The air was thin, cold, alive. The recruits looked younger every year, their eyes bright but untested. She watched as they rigged their ropes, fingers fumbling in the wind. A few whispered under their breath, the way nervous people do. She recognized it immediately, the noise before focus. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't lecture. She didn't bark orders. She simply said, "Slow down. The rope isn't your enemy, panic is." One recruit, a woman with trembling hands, glanced up. "Ma'am, how do you make it stop? The fear." Morgan looked at her for a long moment, remembering her own first descent, the chaos, the silence afterward. "You don't make it stop," she said. "You make it irrelevant." The recruit frowned slightly, confused. Morgan continued, "Fear's just a signal. You can listen to it or you can listen to your training. Choose your voice." The woman nodded, breathed out slowly, and moved. By the time she reached the ground, the tremor was gone. After the exercise, the instructors gathered around Morgan. One of them, young, confident, full of curiosity, asked, "Is it true what they say, that you climbed the Coronado Cliff without a rope?" Morgan gave a small, tired smile. "With one." "But you let go, didn't you?" he pressed. She met his gaze. "Sometimes you have to let go to prove you can hold on." He blinked, caught off guard by the quiet truth in her words. Later that evening, she walked the ridge alone. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, turning the sky into a watercolor of fire and calm. Below her, the valley stretched endlessly, the wind whispering stories only she could hear. She thought of all the people she'd met since that day. The recruits, the officers, even Thorne. Each of them had learned something from that single moment. A moment she hadn't planned, hadn't wanted, but had somehow defined her. And she realized maybe that was the point. You don't choose which moment becomes your story. You only choose how you live it. She crouched near the cliff's edge, placed her hand on the cold rock, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. For what, even she didn't know. Maybe for the reminder that even falls have purpose. Far below, the recruits were still training. One of them looked up, saw her silhouette against the dying light, and felt something shift inside. A strange, silent kind of inspiration that didn't need words. He turned to his friend. "Who is that?" The other shrugged. "Some evaluator. They say she's the one from Morgan's Ledge." The first recruit stared upward again. "You think that story's true?" The second smiled. "Doesn't matter, does it? It's true enough to change how we climb." When she returned to base that night, her phone buzzed again. No name, just coordinates. Different ones this time. She stared at them for a long while, the digits glowing faintly in the dark. Then she closed the screen and slid the phone aside. "Not yet." Some missions wait. Some you outgrow. And maybe, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the scent of salt and distance. Morgan leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, breathing slow. Inhale 4. Hold 4. Exhale 4. The rhythm of a life lived on the edge. Her thoughts drifted, but not to war. To the ledge. The shove. The silence after. And she smiled barely. Because that silence, that was where she'd found herself. In some future classroom, years from now, an instructor will stand before a room of wide-eyed trainees and say, "There was once a sailor who was shoved off a cliff." They'll all lean forward, waiting for the ending. And the instructor will pause, look at them and say, "She didn't fall." Then, after a heartbeat of silence, he'll add, "She climbed." And the room will go quiet. Because they'll understand what those two words mean. That it's not about cliffs or ropes or legends. It's about refusal. The refusal to break. To yield. To shout when silence will do. And that's how stories survive. Not through repetition. Through meaning. Somewhere under starlight, Anna Morgan breathed out one more time. And maybe, if the wind was listening, it carried her words into eternity. Dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Silence has a way of following certain people. For Anna Morgan, it wasn't absence of sound, it was presence of control. Even years after the ledge, after the shove that turned into myth, people still lowered their voices when she walked by. Not out of fear, out of respect they couldn't quite explain. But silence, it can be heavy. She carried it for years, like gear you can't put down because you no longer know where you'd be without it. The Navy had changed. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The lesson of Morgan's ledge had taken root across commands. Instructors spoke differently now. The tone of training had shifted from intimidation to integrity. Even the manuals reflected it. Buried in a section on stress adaptation drills was a new subsection called quiet focus techniques. 4-count breathing, controlled motion, grounding under pressure. No mention of her name, but her fingerprints were all over it. And across the branches, that quiet professionalism began to bleed outward. It wasn't just about climbing cliffs anymore. It was about how people carried themselves under pressure, how they reacted when chaos tested their character. That was her legacy in motion. Unwritten but alive. One afternoon, she received a message from Miller. He was long retired by then, living somewhere along the coast. The message was brief. Base renaming ceremony next month. Morgan's ledge officially entered into training doctrine. Would mean a lot if you came. She stared at the words for a long time. She hadn't been back since that day. Part of her wasn't sure she wanted to. But another part, the part that still believed in closure, knew she needed to see it. When she arrived, the place looked the same but felt different. The same sea wind, the same granite cliffs. But the faces were new, younger, confident. A large bronze plaque stood near the training edge now. Simple engraving. No photo, no fanfare. Just 5 words. Assumptions are heavy, travel light. She stood before it, the wind whipping her hair, and for a moment she heard the laughter again, the condescending chuckles, the shove, the silence that followed. Except now it was all quiet. Master Chief Miller, older, slower, but still sharp, walked up beside her. "Didn't think you'd show." "Didn't think I would either," she said softly. He smiled. "You know they wanted to put your name on it, you refused." She nodded. "Names fade, lessons don't." He looked at her for a long moment. "You still believe that?" "Yes," she said. Then after a pause, "especially now." As they stood there, recruits began gathering for the day's training. Miller watched them. Different generation, he said quietly. Better, she asked. Smarter, he replied. More aware. You changed the way they measure strength. Morgan didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on a young woman at the back of the formation, nervous, small, gripping her rope with trembling hands. Something in that posture felt familiar. Miller followed her gaze. Remind you of someone. Morgan exhaled, her breath slow and even. A little. He smiled knowingly. Go talk to her. Morgan hesitated. You know I don't do speeches. Then don't, he said. Just do what you always do, show. Minutes later, the recruits were lined up at the edge. The instructor gave the safety brief. The young woman's knuckles were white around the rope. Morgan stepped up beside her. The girl froze, realizing who stood there. Ma'am, she stammered. Morgan handed her a pair of gloves. These are better for grip, try them. The girl looked at the gloves, then at her. You're her, aren't you? Morgan said nothing, just gestured toward the cliff. Show me your setup. The girl walked her through the procedure, clips, checks, locks. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Slow down, Morgan said softly. You're not fighting the rope, you're listening to it. The girl blinked, listening. Everything talks, Morgan said. The wind, the rock, your own heartbeat. Learn to hear it before it becomes noise. Then she stepped back. Whenever you're ready. The girl took a breath, exhaled, leaned back, and descended. Her movements were clumsy at first, then steadier, smoother. When she reached the bottom, she looked up, grinning, and shouted, It worked. Morgan didn't smile, not fully, but her eyes softened. Miller, watching from behind, shook his head and muttered, still changing lives by not saying much. Morgan turned, that faint half-smile returning. The less you say, the more they hear. After the session, a small group of instructors invited her to the mess hall. The walls were lined with photos, faces of those who'd trained there over decades. In the center hung a single framed image, the grainy photograph of her halfway up the cliff. Underneath, a quote in simple text. True strength never shouts. She stood there for a long moment. One of the instructors approached. We kept the picture, ma'am. Hope that's all right. She nodded. It's not about me. He smiled. Maybe not, but sometimes we need a face to remember the lesson. She didn't argue. Because maybe he was right. That night, after everyone had gone, she walked the cliffs alone. The moonlight washed over the ocean, turning it into a mirror. She crouched at the edge again, fingers brushing over the rough stone. The scuff marks from years ago were still there, faint but visible. Ghosts of movement, proof of what still lingered. She whispered, You never really leave a place like this. Her voice was carried away by the wind, swallowed by the same sound that had once tested her resolve. In another part of the world, at that same hour, a letter was being read aloud in a classroom at Quantico. A lecture on leadership under pressure. The instructor, a Marine colonel, held up a printed memo. Written by Command Master Chief Miller before he retired, he said. It's now part of required reading for all advanced candidates. He read aloud. The measure of a leader is not how loud they command, but how steady they remain when the noise rises. The lesson of Morgan's Ledge teaches that silence under stress is not weakness, it's mastery. When he finished, the room was silent. Someone in the back raised a hand. Sir, was Morgan real? The colonel looked up from the paper, a faint smile crossing his face. Doesn't matter, son, the lesson is. Back on the coast, the ceremony ended quietly. No speeches, no reporters, just a few dozen people standing in the fading light, watching waves crash against the rocks. Morgan stood off to the side, hands tucked into her jacket pockets. Miller joined her, his hat tucked under his arm. You did good, he said. She looked at him. We did good. He chuckled softly. Maybe, but you're the one who climbed. Morgan's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Sometimes climbing isn't about going up, Master Chief. It's about not letting anyone push you down. He nodded slowly. Guess that's the moral. She smiled faintly, maybe not the only one. As the crowd dispersed, a few young sailors lingered near the plaque, tracing the engraved letters with their fingers. One of them whispered, "Travel light." The others echoed it softly, like a prayer. Morgan turned toward the sea one last time, feeling the wind on her face, the weight of years slipping away. Miller called after her, "You ever think about writing a book?" She shook her head. "No, some stories aren't meant to be told, they're meant to be lived." He smiled, still the same. She started walking toward the parked jeep, her boots crunching over gravel. And as the wind rose behind her, it carried her words into the air, quiet, calm, final. Noise fades, discipline doesn't. The jeep's headlights cut through the dusk as she drove away from the base. The cliffs shrank behind her, the ocean glowing silver in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something that wasn't duty or control. Peace. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She turned the radio on static, then soft music, and let the hum of the road fill the silence. Somewhere between one breath and the next, she realized she wasn't running from ghosts anymore. She was walking beside them. Back on the cliff, the wind carved new patterns into the stone, erasing footprints but never memory. Generations would come and go. Ropes would fray. Trainers would retire. But the lesson would remain, etched not in policy or plaques, but in the minds of every recruit who stepped to the edge and whispered the words they didn't even know belonged to her. Assumptions are heavy, travel light. And far away, under another sky, Anna Morgan sat watching dawn rise over a different sea. She thought of Miller, of the ledge, of all the people who'd learned to breathe through fear, because she once refused to flinch. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making sure someone else never has to prove what you already did." She took a slow breath. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The same rhythm that had carried her through every storm. And when the sun finally broke the horizon, she whispered one last time, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." It's strange how legends grow louder the longer the person stays silent. Years had passed since the ceremony at the cliffs. The recruits who once whispered about Morgan's ascent were now instructors themselves. The myth had outlived its moment, evolving into something larger, purer, almost untouchable. They spoke of her in tones reserved for ghosts and saints. The woman who defied gravity. The operator who turned humiliation into history. The professional who never raised her voice. But time has a way of sanding the edges off truth. The more they told her story, the more they polished it, until the human underneath began to disappear. Anna Morgan was not a ghost. She was flesh and bone. And flesh gets tired. In a small, nondescript town tucked between mountains and sea, she lived alone. No uniform now, no rank, just a cabin with weathered walls and a view of the horizon she'd once fought to reach. Each morning she woke before sunrise, not from discipline, from habit. Old training never truly leaves. She brewed coffee in silence, stared out at the waves and counted her breaths. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The ritual was still there, the control, the calm. But so was the weight, that invisible gravity of a life built on composure. She had mastered the art of stillness, and in doing so, sometimes forgot what motion felt like when it wasn't part of survival. One afternoon, the past found her again. A letter arrived, unmarked, official paper, no signature. She didn't have to open it to know what it meant. A request. A mission. a favor only she could answer. Her thumb hovered over the seal for a long moment before tearing it open. The message was brief. Special Operations Command requests consultation on developing new vertical recovery protocols. Location classified. Immediate response appreciated. At the bottom, for reference, you inspired this. She exhaled softly. The world had found her again. She wasn't surprised. People always come back to the quiet ones when the noise stops working. 2 weeks later, she stood inside a training hangar filled with faces that could have been her younger self. The commanding officer, a tall, deliberate man named Captain Rhodes, approached her with an outstretched hand. "Petty Officer Morgan, it's an honor." "Just Morgan," she said. He smiled. "Of course. We're building a new training doctrine, extreme environment recovery. We thought no one better than you to guide it." She scanned the facility, climbing rigs, vertical towers, simulation chambers. Technology had evolved, but the principle hadn't. "Recovery," she murmured. "Interesting word, sounds better than rescue." Rhodes chuckled. "Words matter to policymakers. Actions matter to professionals," she replied. He didn't argue. He just nodded, as if acknowledging an unspoken hierarchy of truth. For the next month, she trained them, small units of special operators from across the branches. They expected technique. She gave them philosophy. "Don't fight the fall," she told them. "It's not your enemy. Gravity doesn't care. Control what you can, breath, rhythm, thought." One young ranger asked, "Ma'am, how do you stop from freezing up? When it's chaos, when everyone's yelling, when you can't think straight?" Morgan looked at him for a long moment, the memory of 1,000 storms flickering behind her eyes. "You breathe," she said simply. "The noise is always louder right before the silence. Wait for the silence." He frowned slightly. "What happens then?" "Then," she said, "you move." The room went still. And in that silence, every man and woman there understood exactly what she meant, even if they couldn't explain it. At night, when the lights dimmed and the recruits returned to barracks, she stayed behind, sitting on the edge of the climbing rig. She stared down at the mats below, remembering the granite ledge, the wind, the shove. And she realized something that unsettled her more than any mission ever had. The ledge hadn't defined her life, she had led it. She had become its shadow, living as the embodiment of a single act of defiance. But there was more to her story. More to her. She wasn't just the woman who climbed back. She was the woman who'd kept climbing long after she didn't need to. One evening, after a long day of training, Rhodes found her sitting alone on the platform again. "Never met someone who looks more at peace in a room full of noise," he said. She didn't look at him. "Noise is just undisciplined energy, Captain." He chuckled softly. "You ever think about taking a teaching position? Permanently, I mean. We could use minds like yours shaping the next generation." She finally turned toward him, eyes calm, steady. "I don't belong in classrooms. I belong in movement." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe movement's what the classroom needs." She said nothing, but the thought stayed with her. Weeks turned into months. The doctrine grew stronger, more refined. They called it adaptive composure training. Every recruit, every operator, every pilot learned the basics of her method. Breath, rhythm, control. The Morgan sequence, they named it unofficially. It wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to everyone now. And she was fine with that. Mostly. But late at night, alone in her quarters, the silence grew heavier again. Because when your life is built on control, stillness can feel like suffocation. She lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the base generators. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself ask a dangerous question, one she'd buried beneath years of discipline. What happens when the mission ends? She didn't know the answer. Maybe no one does. But she knew one thing, she wasn't done climbing yet. Not cliffs, not walls. Just the invisible heights inside herself that still needed conquering. One night, while walking the training grounds, she passed a small group of recruits practicing rope control drills under floodlights. One of them, a woman no older than 20, struggled to find footing. Her rope tangled, her breathing faltered. Morgan watched from the shadows for a moment, then stepped forward. "Stop," she said quietly. The recruit froze. "Ma'am, I—" Morgan shook her head. "Don't apologize, reset." She took the rope from her, ran it through her fingers, feeling its imperfections, tiny frays invisible to the eye. "This isn't about the rope," Morgan said softly. "It's about what's between your ears. You've already decided you're going to fail. That decision happened before you ever touched the rock." The girl's eyes filled with frustrated tears. "I just can't get it right." Morgan crouched, meeting her gaze. "You can't get it quiet." The recruit frowned. "Quiet." "Your mind," Morgan said. "It's louder than the wind. You have to make it still before your hands can listen." The girl inhaled shakily. "How?" Morgan smiled faintly. "Start with breathing. It's always breathing." She demonstrated. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. The girl mirrored her. Then Morgan said, "Now move." The recruit leaned back, guiding the rope through the belay. Smooth, controlled. No hesitation this time. When she reached the base, she looked up and saw Morgan still standing there, watching. This time Morgan smiled, just a little. Then she turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the floodlight's edge. The following morning, a note appeared taped to the climbing wall. No signature. Just 4 words written in neat block letters. "The quiet is earned." The instructors didn't remove it, they left it there. By the end of the week, every recruit could recite it by heart. Months later, the program was finalized. Rhodes approached her in his office. "It's done," he said. "Your methods are now part of official doctrine. You changed the way we train, Morgan." She nodded slowly. "Good. You don't sound happy." She met his gaze. "Because it's not about happiness, Captain. It's about balance. The moment you think you've won, you stop improving." He smiled faintly. "Always the quiet philosopher." "Always the student," she corrected. That night she packed her things. No ceremony, no goodbye, just movement as always. Before she left, she visited the climbing tower one last time. The note was still there. "The quiet is earned." She ran her fingers over the words, then stepped back, exhaling slowly. The hum of the bass faded behind her as she walked into the night. Out in the open field, the stars stretched across the sky, cold, clear, infinite. She lay back in the grass, staring upward, feeling the earth beneath her and the quiet pulse of her own breath. For the first time in years, she didn't count the seconds. She just breathed. And in that small act, she realized something profound. All her life she had fought gravity. Maybe now it was time to trust it. Because strength wasn't always climbing higher. Sometimes it was knowing when to stop fighting the fall, when to let life hold you instead of resisting it. Back on the base, the morning alarm sounded. New recruits lined up at the climbing wall. They looked at the note, whispered the words to themselves, and began their ascents. Each movement steady, each breath controlled. None of them knew she'd left the night before. None of them knew where she'd gone. But they didn't need to. Because she was still there, in the silence between their heartbeats. In the pause before every movement. In the quiet they were all learning to earn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a lone figure walked along a coastal ridge, the wind tugging at her jacket. No audience, no orders. Just the rhythm of steps against earth and the endless sound of waves. And as the sun broke through the clouds, painting gold across the sea, she whispered to herself. Still climbing. No one knew exactly when she disappeared. There was no dramatic farewell, no folded flag, no final transmission through a headset. Just absence, the kind that lingers longer than presence ever did. They said she walked out of the training compound one evening, past the gate guard with a small nod, and never came back. No car registered leaving the base. No credit card activity. Nothing. It was as if Anna Morgan had dissolved back into the silence she'd taught others to master. At first, the rumors were practical. Maybe she'd transferred. Maybe she'd retired quietly, like Miller. Maybe she'd found peace. But then, as the months turned into years, her story started to grow teeth. Some said she joined a covert program overseas. Others whispered she died on a black op no one could confirm. One recruit even swore she'd seen her in the Hindu Kush, the same mountains Morgan had once climbed to save a man years ago, standing at the edge of a ridge, wind tearing through her hair, watching the sunrise like a guardian of ghosts. No one ever proved it. But no one wanted to, because some legends work better unfinished. Inside the halls of training commands across the branches, her influence deepened. There was the Morgan Standard now, a psychological benchmark used to measure composure under stress. An entire section of advanced combat preparation manuals bore her fingerprints, though never her name. And in the hallways, instructors used her story like a compass. Don't overreact, they'd say. Remember the ledge. Control the breath, another would whisper, Morgan style. Even the new recruits, kids who weren't even born when she'd served, carried her principles in their posture, their silence, their stillness before action. She had become a ghost that trained ghosts. One evening, years later, at a ceremony in Virginia Beach, Command Master Chief Miller stood before a room full of uniformed faces. His hair had gone white. His voice was rough as gravel but still steady. He was speaking at the dedication of a new training center, the Morgan Resilience Complex. Behind him, a simple bronze statue, not of a woman but of a single rope coiled at the base of a granite slab. The inscription read, "Stillness is strength." He cleared his throat, eyes scanning the crowd. "I trained her once," he said. "If you can call it that, truth is she trained all of us." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the room. She never wanted recognition, never wanted attention, but every now and then someone comes along who changes everything, not with noise, not with speeches, but with example. He paused, his gaze softening. "She taught us that you don't climb to prove something. You climb to remind yourself what you're capable of, and you don't need ropes for that." He smiled faintly. "You just need resolve." The room was silent, no applause, just understanding. Because everyone there knew what he meant. Outside, after the ceremony, a young recruit approached him. "Master Chief," she said nervously, "is it true? Did she really fall the way they say she did?" Miller looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same fire that once lived in Morgan's eyes. He said, "No, she was pushed." The girl frowned, but she climbed back up. He nodded slowly. "She didn't climb back, she rose." The recruit tilted her head, trying to understand. Miller smiled sadly. "You'll get it when the world shoves you and you don't move." Then he walked away. Back in the mountains, far from cities and ceremonies, a local boy tending goats along a ridge once told a story. He said he saw a woman living alone in the highlands, quiet, strong, her cabin made of old weathered wood and steel. She rarely spoke, but sometimes helped travelers who lost their way in the fog. She never told her name, he'd say, but she moved like the wind was her ally. The villagers called her the Silent One. Sometimes at dawn, they'd see her standing on the cliffs, arms crossed, watching the sun rise. No gear, no weapon, just presence. When someone once asked why she lived so far from people, she had only smiled and said, "Noise doesn't follow you up here." It's hard to say if that woman was really Anna Morgan. The military never confirmed. No one ever filed an obituary. But somehow, letters began appearing at bases across the country. Unsigned, untraced, written in the same neat, controlled handwriting she'd used in every debrief. Each letter contained just one sentence. To the 3rd Recon Training Unit. You're not defined by the climb, but by what you carry on the way up. To the SEAL School at Coronado. Strength is not surviving the storm, it's teaching others how to stand in it. To the new female candidate class at Annapolis. If they underestimate you, let them. Gravity doesn't care who doubts you. No one ever figured out where the letters came from. But every one of them arrived sealed in wax, stamped with the same symbol. A small rope coiled once open at one end. As her myth grew, it began to reshape more than training. It began to shift perspective. Instructors stopped shouting as much. Recruits stopped panicking when things went wrong. They learned to breathe through adversity instead of fighting it. And somewhere deep down, they all knew who to thank, even if they never said her name aloud. Because saying her name felt sacred. As if the sound itself would disturb the balance she had created. Years passed. Then decades. The world changed again. New wars, new technology, new kinds of soldiers. But every now and then, in quiet corners of briefing rooms, a voice would remind the next generation. Before you go out there, remember Morgan's rule. The recruits would nod, unsure who Morgan was, but they'd feel the weight of the words. And that was enough. On one of those future nights, a storm rolled across the Atlantic coast, wind howling, waves hammering the shore. Inside the Morgan Resilience Complex, a young woman sat alone in the gym, unable to sleep. She just failed her last trial, rope recovery. One mistake, one slip. Tomorrow, she'd be dropped from the program. She sat there, head in her hands, trying not to cry. Then from somewhere in the dark, she heard a voice, not loud but steady. Fear's a good signal, it means you care. She looked up, startled. An older woman was standing by the doorway. Tall, weathered, gray hair tied back. A face calm enough to silence the room itself. "Who are you?" the girl asked. The woman smiled faintly. "Someone who's been where you are." "I messed up," the girl whispered. The woman stepped closer. "No, you learned." The girl frowned, confused. "But I..." The woman interrupted softly. "You failed a trial, not yourself. There's a difference." The girl blinked back, tears. "How do I start again?" The woman placed a hand on her shoulder. "The same way you breathe, one count at a time." And then she was gone, just like that. The next morning the girl returned to the wall. She climbed clean, smooth, perfect. When the instructor asked who had coached her, she said, "A visitor." She didn't say her name. But the instructor's expression changed instantly. He didn't ask more, he just whispered, "Of course she didn't." In the years that followed, that story joined the rest, another impossible moment in a growing legend. The silent one. The ghost of the cliffs. The woman who never fell. Each generation told it a little differently. Each one added its own echo. But the heart of it stayed the same. A woman once shoved off the edge refused to let gravity decide who she was. Sometimes at dawn, sailors standing on ship decks swear they can see her figure in the mist, a lone silhouette on a distant ridge, watching over them. And somewhere in a cabin buried deep in fog, maybe she still sits quietly, listening to the world breathe. Her old climbing rope coiled neatly beside her. Not as a tool anymore. As a memory. A reminder that the edge was never the end, just the beginning of her ascent. The silence she carried has become everyone's. The calm she mastered now lives in others' hearts. And though history will never write her full name, it will always echo her truth. That strength doesn't need an audience. That resilience doesn't need recognition. That the loudest victory is sometimes the quietest survival. In the language of soldiers, there's a phrase passed quietly between instructors now, something not found in manuals or briefings. When someone asks how to handle fear, how to move through chaos, how to stand still in the storm, they just answer with 3 words. Earn the quiet. And everyone understands. Somewhere beyond radar, beyond orders, beyond applause, a woman walks a ridgeline alone, the wind her only witness. She doesn't wear her past anymore. She just breathes it. And when the sun breaks over the horizon, she whispers the words that outlived her name. Still climbing. Time erases faces, not echoes. Years slipped into decades, and the story of the woman who defied gravity became something between a fable and a lesson. A ghost passed down through generations of soldiers who still spoke her name in whispers. Anna Morgan had become more than a person. She was a principle, a code whispered in the quiet between chaos and calm. But the men and women who'd known her, they were fatting too. Master Chief Miller died in his sleep one spring morning. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just peace, the kind of ending he once said was the mark of a complete life. When they found him, his desk was clean. No notes, no papers, no medals, just a single envelope resting beneath a coiled piece of rope. The envelope was addressed to whoever still remembers the ledge. Inside was a short letter, written in his rough handwriting. If you're reading this, you've carried her story further than any of us imagined. I used to think Morgan climbed back because she was strong. Now I know she climbed because she refused to become the push. He paused there, the ink slightly smudged, as though his hand had lingered. Find her if you can, but if you can't, then keep climbing anyway. The letter ended with one final line. The quiet is never gone. It's just waiting for someone to earn it again. They buried him, overlooking the same cliffs where the legend began. No headstone, just a plaque beside the old training wall. Stillness is strength. A few months later, a courier delivered a sealed wooden box to the Naval Academy archives. No return address. No sender. Inside were 3 items. A small worn climbing glove. A faded photograph of a mountain ridge under dawn light. And a notebook, the same one she had once written in long ago. The cover was cracked. The pages smelled of salt and rain. The first page began with 4 words written in clean, deliberate script. For whoever still listens. The rest was a collection of reflections, not instructions, not doctrine, just truth. You will be tested, not when it's loud, but when it's quiet. Control is not absence of fear. It's choosing action despite it. Every climb begins with trust, not in ropes, not in teams, but in yourself. Don't wait for respect, be undeniable. On the final page, a single sentence sat centered, written as if it had been rewritten a dozen times. One day they'll stop saying my name. That's how I'll know I did it right. The archivist who received it read every line in silence, then closed the notebook, her hands trembling. She didn't log it in the public database. She placed it in a drawer labeled Undisclosed Lessons, Personal Archives. And maybe that was right. Maybe some truths aren't meant for catalogs. Meanwhile, across bases, Morgan's influence evolved once more. The Morgan Protocol, now standard across multiple training disciplines, became required study for every branch of elite operations. But even in its formal text, the words felt different, almost sacred. Instructors still began sessions with the same phrase she'd once whispered under her breath before every mission. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. They called it the quiet sequence. Simple, universal, eternal. It wasn't about breathing anymore, not really. It was about remembering that control doesn't start with movement. It starts with stillness. And in that stillness, she still lived. One autumn evening, a young instructor named Ray stood by the cliffs where it had all started. He had been a student of Miller's long ago. Now, older, quieter, he found himself replaying the same ritual Morgan once had. He crouched near the edge, hand on the cold stone, the sea roaring beneath. Beside him, his daughter, 16, curious, eyes like questions. "Dad," she said, "why do they call it Morgan's Ledge?" He smiled softly, because someone climbed it when she wasn't supposed to. Was she the first? No, he said, shaking his head, just the first who didn't talk about it after. His daughter frowned, so she didn't tell anyone. He looked at her. She didn't have to, the story told itself. The girl stared at the horizon, wind tugging her hair, and whispered, "I want to be like her." Ray smiled faintly. "Then learn to listen before you speak." They stood there together, the waves crashing far below, and for a moment, just a moment, the world felt perfectly balanced between silence and motion. Far from that place, in a remote village between mountains, a storm rolled over the valley. A figure moved through the rain, slow, deliberate, wearing an old weatherproof coat and a backpack that looked older than its owner. She stopped by the trail where the earth met the mist, setting down her pack and staring into the distance. The cabin still stood, weathered, empty. She smiled faintly. Time hadn't touched the rocks. The world had simply continued, like it always does when you stop trying to control it. Inside the cabin, dust clung to every surface. But on the table, untouched, sat her old radio, cracked, silent, waiting. She turned the knob once, the static hummed. Then she whispered into the receiver, her voice quiet, aged but still strong. "This is Morgan, still standing." No one answered. But somewhere across the frequencies of time and distance, her words seemed to echo back, as if the silence itself had learned to respond. Later that night, she stepped outside, the storm breaking into drizzle. The moonlight fell across the wet ground, and she could see her reflection in a shallow puddle, older, lined but alive. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to say something she had never said out loud. "I forgive them." The words were light, they didn't need force. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was release. She wasn't forgiving the shove, or the voices that mocked, or the world that doubted her. She was forgiving the version of herself that carried the weight for so long. Because strength isn't holding everything. It's knowing what to finally set down. At dawn, she hiked up the ridge, the same climb she had once made in the dark, alone, terrified. Her hands moved with practiced grace, her breathing steady, her mind clear. When she reached the summit, the horizon was just beginning to bloom, a wash of pink and gold spilling across the clouds. She stood there, wind cutting through the silence, and closed her eyes. She didn't pray. She didn't speak. She simply breathed. And somewhere inside that breath, everything finally stilled. The wars, the training, the legends, even the noise of memory. All of it softened into quiet understanding. Down below, the world kept spinning. New soldiers trained. New stories began. But now and then, someone standing at the edge of that same cliff would feel something unexplainable, a calm that came from nowhere. They'd look out at the sea, take one deep breath, and whisper. Earn the quiet. They never knew who said it first. They just knew it felt right. In time, her name faded from the records. Files deleted, reports condensed. Her story became rumor, then ritual, then myth. But the truth survived in the spaces where noise could never reach, in discipline, in breath, in stillness. And maybe that's how she wanted it. Because she never needed a statue. She just needed the silence to mean something. One last time, under an endless sky, a breeze carried her whisper over the cliffs. Still climbing. The sea answered back, its rhythm matching her breath. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The eternal pattern. The quiet beyond the climb. And in that silence she was home. Years later, a recruit standing before the plaque at Morgan's ledge traced the engraved words with her fingers and said softly, "I wish I could have met her." The instructor beside her smiled. "You already have, every time you stood at the edge and refused to fall." The girl smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. "Was she really that good?" she asked. The instructor looked at the horizon, where sky met sea in an unbroken line. "No," he said, "she was better, she was real." And as the wind rolled in from the water, he added quietly, almost to himself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." And the waves went on forever. And the legend kept breathing. Because gravity never wins against those who know how to rise.